He drank poison to die in peace. Then they boiled him in wine. Welcome to Royal Tortures. I'm your host, Ian Cartwell. Let me know where you're tuning in from by commenting below. Your presence fuels these dark tales. Let's begin. The scream did not sound human. It tore through the corridors like boiling liquid over flesh, a sound dragged raw from the throat of a creature neither dead nor fully alive. Beneath the vaulted stones of a fortress reeking of incense and betrayal, something more grotesque than execution unfolded. The flesh did not char instantly. It wept. It blistered. The fire, fed not by oil or pitch but by sacrament, spiced wine made thick and ceremonial, lapped slowly at the ruined body. This was not death as punishment. This was death as spectacle. The emperor, bound in gilded irons, had swallowed his own poison hours before. Yet his chest still rose, barely, like a condemned saint waiting for miracle or damnation. He did not die quickly. He was made to endure, to sizzle under layers of velvet-soaked protocol. Steam curled from the mouth as if his very soul had begun to boil. And in the hushed crowd beyond the tapestried archway, no one wept. They watched. They watched because they had paid for this moment with loyalty and fear. Because when an empire punishes betrayal, it does so not with a blade, but with a mirror held to every coward watching. He was born with too many names, each syllable added not by affection, but ambition, lineage stacked like marble columns, intended to awe and oppress. In the waning light of the 4th century's twilight, when Rome had already begun to crack along its own spine and the East clawed at divinity with trembling hands, the boy was delivered into silks soaked more in prophecy than blood. They named him Aurelius Cassianus Theodorus, and the wet nurse who held him first whispered not blessings but warnings beneath her breath. His eyes were black from the beginning, not in color, but in depth. They did not reflect the room. They consumed it. The palace in Nicomedia was a cradle of fire and false peace. Born to a line of men who wrapped themselves in godhood as if it might keep them warm against rebellion, Aurelius grew not in innocence but in shadows. From his earliest days he was taught that sovereignty was a fragile disguise, stitched together by lies, marriages, and blood sealed behind lead walls. At 6, he watched a eunuch flayed in the courtyard for whispering dissent. At 7, he was forced to kneel at the feet of a dying general and whisper forgiveness that was never his to give. The emperor, his uncle, watched both acts with the same expressionless reverence he gave to Mass. A boy who learned that piety could murder more quietly than a sword would not forget it. By adolescence, Aurelius was not beloved, but obeyed. He spoke seldom and smiled never. His education was surgical. Treatises on poison, long-forgotten punishments from Carthage, scrolls bound in flesh detailing how the Persians unstitched a man's mind before his limbs. He did not flinch. He wrote annotations. His tutors said he was brilliant. His nursemaids said he was cursed. His own mother, who had once been a daughter of Greece, stopped speaking to him when he was 12. She claimed his presence made her dream of rats and fire. When the old emperor choked on a fig stuffed with goat's brain and regret, Aurelius was 17. His coronation was less a celebration than a silencing. Every rival claimant vanished into crypts or cloisters. The wine flowed richly, but the bread remained dry. Even the sky dimmed, clouds gathering in thick, viscous knots above the basilica as if heaven itself refused to attend. That evening, he passed by a mirror and did not recognize the face within. Not because it had changed, but because it finally looked as it always should, bloodless, controlled, crowned in dread. He did not rule. He distilled. Law, like marrow, was to be boiled from the bones of chaos. His first act was not to bless the people, but to exhume a previous traitor and have him displayed upside down in the center of the forum, worms crawling from his nostrils. "Let them see what patience looks like," he said once, to no one in particular. And indeed it was patience he mastered. Not rage, not greed, but the cold discipline of waiting, for the perfect season to rot every fruit, for the ripest betrayal to warrant an unhurried, unforgettable reckoning. It was not long before whispers followed him, not of madness but of precision. He did not murder indiscriminately. He murdered symbolically. A noble who blasphemed against the crown's divine right was sewn into a calf's carcass and left beneath the sun. A bishop who spoke of humility was flayed and dressed in his own vestments. And yet the people did not revolt. Fear, after all, is a form of loyalty, especially when the punishments were framed as rituals, as restorations of ancient order. Aurelius was not a tyrant. He was a priest with a pyre. Still, something else moved beneath the surface of his reign, something more fragile and less nameable than cruelty. It lingered in the way he looked at statues, never at people. In the fact that his personal chambers were lit not with flame but with flickering glass globes filled with wine-dark liquid. In his refusal to sleep in the same room twice. His paranoia wore the costume of ritual. His daily bath in water mixed with myrrh and vinegar. The way he ordered scribes to recopy imperial decrees even when unchanged, so that the ink does not forget. He ruled for 6 years before the first poison entered his cup. Not enough to kill, just enough to speak. The poison did not arrive with ceremony. It came in a goblet that looked like every other, rimmed in gold, engraved with a procession of lions devouring lambs. The wine within bore no trace of bitterness. It was warm, heavy, scented faintly of cloves and rot. He drank it as he drank everything, slowly, without pleasure. That evening he dreamt of his own hands burning, not in flame, but in fever, flesh melting, bones revealing themselves like whispered secrets. At first he told no one. He believed it a message, not an affliction. His mind had always leaned toward symbols, and this grotesque warmth felt like divine commentary. But the symptoms returned, growing with each sip of wine, each ritual mouthful of consecrated sweetness. His body began to tremble in sleep. He bled from the gums when he recited scripture. His reflection rippled even in still water. By the 3rd month he ceased appearing in daylight. He claimed the sun mocked him, revealing imperfections no man should behold. Candles became his only companions, hundreds of them, lit at all hours, their melted bodies littering the palace like a slow, waxen funeral. He paced at night, barefoot and silent, reciting the names of the dead aloud. Not enemies, not traitors, but those he had loved, if he had ever truly loved. A cousin who once taught him to whistle. A girl with ink-stained fingers who had painted lions on his boots as a child. A servant boy who had vanished after asking if emperors wept. He spoke to them as though they hovered just behind the curtain. And perhaps they did. For in madness the dead are not silent. They rearranged themselves into conscience. His court grew silent around him. The ministers whispered in corners, mouths hidden behind scented sleeves. Physicians offered tinctures, but none dared say what they saw. The emperor was no longer whole. His voice cracked in the middle of commands. His sentences lost their endings. He began to forget the names of those who still lived. And when reminded, he punished them for not dying sooner. He accused the basilica of betrayal. He ordered the cathedral bells melted and reformed into shackles. To bind heaven to the earth it forgot. When a flock of crows nested in the palace towers, He declared them omens of his second birth. "I am being rewritten," he said to the wall, as servants dressed him in a robe too large for his shrinking frame. "I am being boiled down to truth." One by one the loyal fled, not to escape punishment, but to escape the collapse of certainty. For to serve a mad emperor is to doubt reality itself. The guards remained only out of fear. His scribes wept ink onto parchment as they tried to transcribe the new decrees. Some illegible, some circular, some written in a language no one taught him. He began to carry a vial of wine around his neck, sealed with wax and thorn. It was rumored to contain not wine at all, but a reduction of poison, holy water, and his own blood. "When I am ready," he murmured once, "this shall burn me from the inside. That will be just." And somehow it was not the statement that terrified the court, but the sincerity with which he believed it. On the first day of the 5th year of his reign, he stood before his council draped in a shroud, not a robe. "I am the death of what I built," he announced. "Therefore I am pure." He ordered statues of himself shattered, melted down into coins bearing no face. He wrote a letter to a foreign king in which he confessed to crimes no one could prove, but many suspected. He signed it not as emperor, but as the last embodied lie. It was clear to all that Aurelius Cassianus Theodorus was no longer alive in any human sense. He breathed, he walked, he even ruled. But the man had vanished beneath the weight of his own crown, drowned in wine and paranoia, poisoned not by enemies but by symbols he could no longer control. His reign had become a theater of ruin. Each day another act in a play that no one applauded. But all theater must end. And some endings are written not with ink, but with fire. It began in silence, not the absence of sound, but the muting of will.
No bells tolled.
No declarations rang across the forum. When the decision was made, it did not come from a vote or a blade, but from a shifting of air, as if the palace itself had exhaled. Those closest to the throne did not speak of treason. They spoke of necessity. An empire cannot breathe through madness. It must cauterize its own wound, even if the flesh is sacred. They did not storm his chambers. They entered in procession, barefoot, robed, eyes cast downward. A ritual, not a rebellion. He did not resist. He stood at the center of the hall, pale and skeletal beneath a robe soaked in myrrh and old sweat, his fingers clutching the vial that had long hung from his neck. "I have already begun," he whispered and drank. It should have killed him. The contents were alchemical and ancient. Distilled belladonna, fragments of lead filings, a tincture derived from burnt laurel and crushed opium poppy. The dosage would have silenced a bull. But the emperor did not fall. He did not even sway. He merely closed his eyes, and for a moment, smiled. Then the heat began. They brought him not to a scaffold, but to the baths of Dionysius, long emptied of water, repurposed into a theater of atonement. In the center of the caldarium stood a great bronze cauldron, once used for perfumed waters and healing oils. Now it had been altered, reinforced beneath by a pit of coal, surrounded by bricks painted with scenes of martyrdom. It was not called an execution. It was called a transmutation. He was stripped by trembling hands, not out of cruelty but precision. They removed the robe, then the chains, then the ring from his finger. Each item was laid upon velvet cloth, as if artifacts from a saint. His body, once imperial, was pale and pocked with self-inflicted wounds, nail marks, lash scars, a lattice of purple veins tracing up from the stomach to the throat. He was already unraveling. What came next was simply the revealing. They placed him inside the cauldron, not laid, but seated, upright, spine erect, arms folded across his chest like a pharaoh waiting for judgment. The wine was poured in last. Not just any wine, but the ceremonial blend used in coronations. Red as arterial blood, sweet with decay, scented with clove and crushed violets. It filled the basin until his thighs disappeared beneath the liquid, his skin already pinking from the warmth. A priest anointed his brow with oil, not for forgiveness but for containment. Then they lit the fire. It did not blaze. It breathed. The coal pit beneath glowed softly at first, a gentle pulse of orange, like the world preparing to birth its own executioner. Steam began to rise, not in great clouds, but in threads, as if his soul were leaving strand by strand. The emperor did not scream. Not yet. He kept his eyes closed and murmured what sounded like scripture, but no one could find the words in any holy book. When the wine began to boil, the transformation became visible. His skin flushed red, then blistered, then cracked. The scent was unbearable. A mix of incense, roasted flesh, and something sweeter, fouler, more intimate. Those in attendance covered their mouths, not just against the stench, but the sacrilege. This was not a death. It was a slow undoing. Every layer of his identity peeled back by heat and time, until only raw memory remained. Still, he did not die. As the flames surged higher and the wine bubbled around him, his lips continued to move. A list, prayer, confession. No one could say, but the words kept coming, even as his tongue blistered and the blood from his gums tinted the liquid a deeper crimson. One hand jerked upward briefly, then sank again, as if even muscle could not decide whether to flee or remain for penance. At the third hour he screamed, not as a man, as something stripped of human form. It echoed not just through the baths, but into the stones, into the city, into the air itself. Birds scattered, children cried, dogs refused to move. It was the sound of sovereignty melting, and still he lived. It became clear that the poison had not been enough, that the heat alone could not undo him, that something in his body, his belief, his guilt, his sheer imperial stubbornness refused to perish. A decision was made. A blade, cold and ceremonial, was lowered into the cauldron. It pierced beneath the rib, turned sideways and twisted, releasing a plume of red steam that smelled of iron and absolution. The emperor's head tilted back. His mouth opened one final time, but no words came, only silence, and then stillness. The fire was extinguished. The wine turned black. His body, or what remained of it, was lifted with tongs and placed upon a stone altar. There would be no burial, only sealing. His flesh, scorched and shriveled, was wrapped in linen soaked in ashen oil, then encased in a sarcophagus lined with lead, sealed with the imperial crest, a lion swallowing its own tail. They called it mercy, but no one believed it. The morning after his body was sealed, the palace windows cracked, not from weather or war, but from something quieter, deeper, as if the building itself had inhaled poison.
No trumpet sounded.
No black banners were raised. The city awoke to an absence too large to name. The emperor was dead, and no one dared say it aloud. They burned the robes. Every garment he had ever worn was brought to the central square, soaked in lye, and ignited beneath the gaze of the very statues he had once condemned to be melted. The crowd was gathered by decree, not devotion. Their faces, stiff with the discipline of survival, did not mourn. They watched, and in that watching, something unspeakable passed between them, a shared relief curdled by shame. A tyrant gone was still a death, and death, when public, leaves a residue. His chambers were sealed, not by guards but by stone. Masons labored in silence, layering the thresholds with brick and molten pitch. Inside, nothing was touched. The bed still bore the indentation of his final sleep. The candle wax lay thick as blood around the cold basin. The walls whispered. It was said the scent of burnt wine lingered for weeks, refusing to be scrubbed from the marble. One servant, tasked with entering the room to extinguish the eternal flame, gouged out her own eyes afterward. He was not gone, she wept. He was waiting. The Senate reconvened in half-light, their robes stiff with dust and caution. They did not debate who would follow. They debated how to erase. All imperial records bearing his signature were collected and thrown into the river Lycus. Every coin minted in his image was recalled and melted, the silver twisted into chains for foreign prisoners. The great mosaic of his coronation, once gilded in sapphires and opal, was shattered by a boy with a hammer too large for his arms. Each piece was buried separately in consecrated ground. Yet the people remembered, not with affection, but with the twitch of memory that follows trauma. They remembered the eyes, black and all-consuming, the decrees carved into bone, the nights when the palace lights never dimmed. Mothers warned children that to lie was to drink the emperor's wine. Street actors whispered that his voice could still be heard if you placed your ear to a cooled cauldron. And then the weather turned. Winds rose from the east, dry and relentless. The vineyards withered. The river ran dark for a week, and when the bishop blessed it, 3 lepers were found dead along its banks, their hands folded as though in mockery of prayer. Earthquakes, though minor, cracked the stone near his sarcophagus. Hairline fractures, but enough to stir murmurs that he had not been cleansed properly, that something remained unburned. In desperation or guilt, the court declared a new festival, the Day of Atonement. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, the empire would fast. No wine, no fire, no public speech. The silence, they said, was sacred. It would keep him from returning. But silence is not absence. It is memory without voice. And so they lived beneath that silence, under a new emperor, pliable, pious, forgettable. A man chosen not to rule, but to never become myth. His edicts were cautious, his rituals borrowed, his punishments light. But behind every smile, every sermon, every coin minted in someone else's face, lay the knowledge that once, just once, an emperor had boiled in wine and refused to die until he burned. The palace walls remained standing. The baths, now emptied, became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the sacredness of pain. And once, years later, a young soldier placed his hand against the bronze basin and swore he felt it thrum. No child bore his name. No statue remained untoppled. Yet Aurelius Cassianus Theodorus did not vanish. He metastasized not as man but as omen. In backrooms and cloisters, in whispered sermons beneath the breath of torchlight, his death was not a punishment but a prophecy. The one who burned without dying. They began to call him the sovereign who boiled but would not yield. His name, erased from scroll and stone, was scrawled anew on parchment wrapped in secrecy and bile. It began with the scribes. Those who once transcribed his madness into law could not forget the cadence of his words. One fled to the coast and wrote a treatise on divine punishment, using only metaphors of fire and fermentation. Another carved into the stone of a well the phrase, "He did not scream until the 3rd hour." The well was later sealed, but the phrase endured, copied, etched into doors, murmured by those who feared that evil, once ritualized, can resurrect through remembrance. Among the peasantry, legends grew where history had been buried. They said the emperor's blood had never cooled, that the lead tomb was only a skin, and beneath it, his organs still pulsed with holy poison. Farmers claimed the vines nearest the palace soured with every harvest. Mothers smeared ash beneath their children's feet to walk quieter than the dead. A midwife in Thessalonica delivered a stillborn with blackened lips and declared it touched by the emperor's spirit. They burned her Eve for it. In Constantinople, a playwright staged a forbidden performance. The Emperor's Wine, a tragedy of veiled identities and rotting crowns. It lasted one night. The stage caught fire during the final act. All 10 actors perished. None were buried whole. The Senate banned all theater for a season, and for a year afterward, no public fires were permitted after sundown. But superstition was not the only thing that endured. Power learned from pain. Those who ruled after Aurelius studied him not as tyrant, but as template. They copied his silence, his precision, his spectacle. Executions became more theatrical, more symbolic. A man found guilty of heresy was locked in a vat of ink until his skin absorbed it and he wept black tears. A traitor was forced to swallow a scroll of false testimony, then strangled with its binding thread. None of these punishments were named as tributes, but all bore his rhythm. Even the church, once silent, began to react. They sanctified the very concept of mercy in opposition to him, canonizing saints who had suffered not by sword, but by flame and boiling oil. They taught that true martyrdom was silent, that the emperor's death, though grotesque, had purged the world of a deeper rot. They built a chapel over the site of his death, not as honor, as containment. The altar bore no cross, only a chalice, overturned, cast in iron. Years passed, then decades, then dynasties. Each time a sovereign feared rebellion, the name would reemerge, not in state decrees, but in private nightmares. He became the patron of paranoia, the god of self-destruction. His likeness, painted once in secret, showed a man crowned not with gold but with steam. Eyes hollow, mouth agape, as if forever mid-scream. And then, curiously, came the wine. Across the empire, vintners began reporting casks spoiling without cause. The grapes near the old capital began to yield a bitter, almost metallic sweetness. Some said it was coincidence. Others that the soil remembered. In one chilling account, a merchant from Antioch bottled a rare vintage he claimed had boiled itself during ferment. He drank it with his household. None survived the night. The empire, once bound by sword and senate, now labored under something less visible. A fear that beneath every law, every ritual, every sip of consecrated blood-red wine, something remained unburied. Something that did not burn clean. He was not immortal, but he was unfinished. The silence that followed his death was not a forgetting, but a fermentation. Memory, like wine, curdles in darkness, thickens, sweetens, grows dangerous with time. And so it was with Aurelius Cassianus Theodorus. Not a man, not a ruler, but a presence too complex for prayer, too volatile for history, too symbolic to remain dead. In the decades that followed, his story fractured into reflections. No longer a coherent biography, but a collection of symbols, each warped through the mirror of fear. In one manuscript, he is a god of retribution who rose in fire to punish false prophets. In another, a demon who boiled to birth 1,000 plagues. A few dared to write of him as a misunderstood martyr, a king who drank poison to atone for imperial sin. But the truest legacy was more elemental, more terrifying. He became the question no sovereign could answer. How does power die? Not with exile nor with sword, but with slowness, with fire that does not cleanse but exposes, with poison that fails, with the gaze of 1,000 citizens who do not weep. His sealed tomb became more than a grave, it became a theological contradiction. Pilgrims visited it not to mourn, but to measure their own capacity for cruelty. It was said that if you whispered a lie before the lead sarcophagus, the air would warm, just enough to raise gooseflesh. That a true confession spoken there would draw blood from your gums. A punishment long past still echoing in the breath of the stone. Even the wine, what once symbolized blessing, lineage, sacrament, became suspect. For centuries after, emperors avoided it in public. Communion rituals were changed to water. Chalices were refashioned in glass, so all might see what they swallowed. Yet it made no difference. Poison was no longer in the cup. It was in the thought, in the flicker of doubt behind a noble's eyes, in the sweat beading on a steward's brow, in the knowledge that once an emperor had drunk deeply and still required burning to die. This was not mercy. This was memory, and in memory he endured, through rituals abandoned, through feast days unspoken, through art defaced and laws annulled. He endured in the way rot endures, beneath the surface patient, omnipresent. In the shiver one feels when a room grows too still, in the cough of incense that smells too sweet, in the flicker of candlelight that seems to breathe. He was not mourned. He was ritualized, as warning, as wound, as the empire's buried conscience. No song was ever written for him. No coin bore his effigy again. Yet he lived on in caution, in muttered proverbs and locked cellars, in the eyes of emperors who understood that absolute power does not die with dignity. It dies in stages, boiling, blind, and screaming. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, in a tomb lined with lead and lined again with silence, a single word remains carved in the lid, barely visible now beneath corrosion and time. Remember.